translating the new institutional student information record. Featuring Kira Mosley Hobbs, Director, Policy Implementation and Liaison Group.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome back to another session for 2024 Federal Student Aid Training Conference. Today, I will be presenting to you breakout session number 15. We'll be going into translating the new ISIR. Hopefully, it's not too new for everyone still, but generally it is. One of the things I want to point out about the ISIR is that your layout is actually going to depend on your processing system. So I'm just going to go through the basic sections within the ISIR, and then I'm also going to go through, some helpful tips of what you're looking at and how to translate what it is that you are looking at. So for the agenda today, we'll go through the ISIR layout, and then we will go through a little bit about the Pell Grant eligibility and the Student Aid Index. Now, I'm not going to go into too much of a deep dive of the SAI calculation and the Pell Grant eligibility formula. Just a reminder, it is separate now, starting with 24-25. I'm going to touch on it a little bit so that you can know what you're looking at on the ISIR, but I'm not going to get too deeply into it at this particular session. So what is an ISIR? An ISIR is an institutional student information record. It contains the data from the FAFSA. It also contains the processing results that we have from when we actually process the FAFSA. And it's also going to pull in information from NSLDS in terms of the students' Pell disbursements, loan history, all of that information from NSLDS. Our FAFSA processing system, or FPS, is replacing what you knew as CPS, which is the central processing system. So that was one of the system changes that came with 24-25. We no longer have a CPS. It is now FPS. The difference is central processing system compared to the FAFSA processing system. But you still get the ISIR. We didn't change that too much. That's one thing that stayed consistently the same. And ISIRs are still delivered to the schools via the Electronic Data Exchange, or the EDE, and you will continue to use the ISIR for packaging. And packaging for our neophytes is the process you go through in order to offer student financial aid, and that's going to include federal student aid, and we'll get into, of course, the Pell Grant in a little bit. So now we're getting to the ISIR layout. So the ISIR layout, I'm going to go across 3 different slides to go through the different sections that's in the ISIR layout now. The first section is going to be new. We're going to have the ISIR transaction identification data, which is going to include the universally unique identifiers, or the UUIDs. There are 3 different UUIDs, and I'll get to that a little bit more later on also. Of course, you have your student demographic identity and contact information, or PII, as we say it in other places. You have your student non-financial information, which is your dependency status and your marital status information. We have student demographic information for high school name and citizenship. And then we have the student manually entered financial information if they were presented with the opportunity to manually enter financial information. I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And then we have the student school choices, the consent and approval, which is 2 different things, and the signature for the FAFSA in general. And then we have the same sections for the student spouse and the parent spouse. And then we continue on, and then you have another section, which is the FAFSA processing system flags and indicators. That is also the section, especially for 24-25, when we were doing some reprocessing, and we would know it would be reprocessing flag 04. It was appearing in that section. That's an example of that. We also have a section on corrections and highlights. We have a section on matches and other processing information. So that's going to be your Social Security Administration matches, your DHS matches, things like that. We have the actually broken down NSLDS information. And then we have the federal tax information, or FTI. That's the stuff that you guys are supposed to protect with your lives. And so those are the section of the ISIR. Now, family size is one of the new sections within the ISIR that was a little confusing for folks. So your family size replaces your household size in the previous year. So in the SAI environment, family size replaces household size. But the family size is going to come from the tax return for IRS tax filers. That means that family size is now determined by IRS tax filing code. And it's not necessarily who is on the tax return, it's who is eligible to have been on the tax return. However, that's only something to remember when it comes to updating the family size, which every FAFSA applicant is going to be given the opportunity to do. But in general, when tax information comes over via the FADDX, the family size is going to come over from the tax return, and it's going to be basically adding up all of what used to be the exemptions on the tax returns. You don't have exemptions anymore, so it's going to add up the individuals on the tax returns or the tax filer, so it might be the student or the student and spouse, and then all of their dependents. Assumed family size happens when the family size that's coming over on the tax return does not make any logical sense to the situation that is on the FAFSA. So for example, if you have a student who state that they were married and their taxes only shows themselves on the tax return, that means the family size would be 1. But in the FAFSA logic, that doesn't make any sense because the student is married. So what the FAFSA is going to do is going to account for an assumed family size of 2, because the family size that came over from the tax return doesn't make any logical sense, because it has to be more than 1 because the student indicated on the FAFSA that they are married. You can have that same type of situation with a dependent student with their parents. If you have a dependent student with their parents and the parents indicate that they are married, and when the information comes over from the tax returns and it gives you a family size of 2, for example, the FAFSA knows that that doesn't make any logical sense. The family size needs to be at least 3 because the student parents said that they were married. So your family size at the minimum needs to be the parent spouse, and the student on the FAFSA. Every student who completes the FAFSA is provided the opportunity to manually update their family size. And this is not because there's anything in the logic flow that suggested there should be an update on the family size. It's just because in the FAFSA Simplification Act, we are dictated to present that opportunity to every FAFSA applicant. So every FAFSA applicant is asked if they need to update their family size. As you can see from the screenshot, we first asked the question if the family size or the number of dependents or individuals in the family is different than what was filed in the prior year tax return. If they say no, they can move forward on the FAFSA. There's no need to update the family size. If they say yes, they're presented with the opportunity on the second part of that screenshot that gives them the opportunity to update the family size. The green box that you see there that has the little house logo on it, it's telling them an assumption minimum family size if they're going to update. So in the example that I just gave of a dependent student whose parents are married, it's reminding the student that your family size really needs to be at least 3 because it needs to be you and your 2 parents. And then it asks, are there additional dependents in that family that should be accounted for in the family size? And that will result in an updated family size. So for example, if you have a dependent student whose parents are married, there's a clue there that the family size needs to be at least 3. But if the student has 2 additional siblings, they have an opportunity to indicate those 2 additional siblings. That way, that family size will increase to 5. Now, when it comes to unborn children, in the old environment, you can count unborn children if they were going to be born within the award year. However, remember I said that family size is now connected to taxes and tax returns. And under the tax code, you cannot count an unborn child as a dependent. So we have to follow that guidance for FAFSA purposes. So an unborn child, you're not going to count them in the family size if the child is not born at the time that the FAFSA is being completed. However, if the child is born within the award year as a school and institution, you can update the family size with the now born child and the additional member of the family. So on the ISIR record layout, you're going to see the three instances of the three different family size possibilities that I just went over. You see the updated family size, and that is when the student manually updates the family size. You have the assumed family size, which happens when the FTI doesn't make logical sense based on the other information that's on the FAFSA. And then, of course, you have the FTI family size, which is just importing with the income and tax information. The reason why on this slide it's in kind of a different order than what I just provided to you is because this is the hierarchy order that the SAI calculation and the Pell Grant formula calculation is going to use when determining which family size to use in the calculation. It will use the updated family size because it's considered to be the most accurate family size, even if there is FTI. It will use the assumed family size when there is no updated family size reported and the FTI family size doesn't make any logical sense. And it will use the FTI family size when there is no need for an assumed family size and the student does not provide an updated family size. However, even within the FAFSA, when we talk about the updated family size, I'm not too sure if I mentioned it, the directions there direct the student or the parents for a dependent student that even when updating the family size, it still has to fall within the parameters of the IRS code, meaning the people that they report as dependents needed to have been eligible to be included on their tax return. Not that they actually needed to be, that they would have met the eligibility to be included on that student's or on that parent's tax return. So when it comes to family size and verification and conflicting information, if we do not use an assumed family size or manually entered family size, and this is just for people who are selected for verification parts, or if your institution does institutional selected for verification and you're verifying family size. If the FTI is used, then you don't have to verify because, again, FTI is the source of truth when it comes to income and tax information. And since the family size is coming over from the tax return, if the FTI is used, no further action is needed from you. If the student is selected for verification and there is an assumed family size or an updated family size, then you need to verify that family size number. Verification of family size is the same as it was in the past years. Whatever method that your institution was using, whichever form, you can continue to do that to verify family size. It's the same thing. You have to treat conflicting information if you have different information about family size to make sure you have the most up-to-date and accurate information with family size. So the universally unique identifiers, or the UUIDs, are ISIR transaction identifiers, and you have three versions of it. You have a transaction UUID, which is all the individual ISIR transactions for that student. And as you know, a student can have ISIR transaction 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and so on one FAFSA for one award year. Then you have the FAFSA UUID, which is specific to the processing cycle. So one student, for example, Kira, will have a FAFSA UUID for her 24-25 FAFSA, and then she'll have a FAFSA UUID for her 25-26 FAFSA, and so on and so on and so on. And then you have a person UUID, which is going to be specific to the processing cycle for this year. Eventually, the person UUID is going to be connected to the student, and it will travel with the student throughout their FAFSA experience across award years. But we're not going to have that between 24-25 and 25-26 right now as of yet. So keep that in mind. So ISIR comment codes continue to appear on the ISIR. Of course, you only have one ISIR comment code for one potential ISIR comment. You have a couple new ISIR comment codes for 24-25 going forward. A couple of ones I want to point out specifically is you have the different ISIR comment codes between provisionally independent students and unaccompanied homeless youth. And of course, more information on the ISIR comment codes. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Is in the 24-25 FAFSA Specifications Guide, Volume 7, which is the comment codes. And then in future award years, the same FAFSA Specifications Guide, Volume 7, is going to continue to include the comment codes so you can find them there. Of course, the ISIR is also going to include ISIR reject codes. ISIR reject codes give you the reason that the ISIR is rejected. Some of the most common is things like signatures, Verifiable ISAR comment codes are ones that the institution may just need to verify. You may not necessarily need to make a change. Non-verifiable are ones that you would need to make a change or provide some information. Reject comment codes may also include, most often, no SAI calculation, no Pell eligibility calculated either, because it is a rejected ISAR. And a reject one for provisionally independent students who have a provisionally SAI is also a reject comment code. And you get that because you as an institution needs to make a determination of whether or not the student is going to be independent because of an unusual circumstance. You may have to do that for some unaccompanied homeless youth situations on the FAFSA if they indicate that they are an unaccompanied homeless youth and they don't have a determination by one of the authorizing officials. They will go through the same path as a provisionally independent student so that they can complete the FAFSA without parent information, but it's two different categories, two different situations, and so you make two different determinations based on our guidance that we have out there for unaccompanied homeless youth and provisionally independent students. So here are a couple of different ISAR resources for you. Of course, we just touched on a little bit the FAFSA specification guides. You have volume 4, 5, and 6, and 7, gives you more information about the ISAR, including comment codes, the general ISAR guide, edits and rejects, and the ISAR record layout. And then you have electronic announcements like Electronic Announcement 2424 that gives more information and updates on the 2425 ISAR delivery that has started. But continue to look out on the Knowledge Center for up-to-date information about 2526 ISAR record layouts and specification guides that are available. And then you have your family size resources, Appendix C of the FAFSA Pell Eligibility and the SAI Guide, which is also on the Knowledge Center. Appendix C also gives you that information that we just went through about the family size, the difference between updated, assumed, and the FTI. And we also have a family size microlearning video through the FSA Training Center that you might want to look at. The FSA Training Center is free. And when we do presentations and other training, we record it and we have it there for you to access whenever you have the opportunity at your convenience. So we'll get a little bit into Pell Grant eligibility and the Student Aid Index. Again, I'm not going to do too much of a deep dive because there are other sessions for that where they can get a little bit deeper into it. And I'm going to really recommend that you attend those sessions because of the extreme difference between 23-24 and 24-25, which is the breakout of the Student Aid Index from Pell Grant eligibility. In the old environment, the EFC determined the Pell Grant eligibility. So you had the 0 EFC, gave you maximum Pell Grant. Those two are kind of separate now. Well, they really are separate now, but they can be related, but they're separate now. But I'm going to get into that in a second. So field 18 of the ISAR is the SAI. A SAI can be anywhere between a negative 1500, so we go negative now, all the way up to 999 in blank. Field 571 of the ISAR is your Pell Grant eligibility flag. You will have a yes there if the transaction determines that the student is eligible for the Pell Grant, and you will have a blank there if the transaction determines that the student is not eligible for a federal Pell Grant. So it's either yes or blank. It is not yes or no. So on the ISAR now, because the formulas are separate, for Pell Grant eligibility, you have Pell Grant indicators. You have a maximum Pell Grant indicator. You have a minimum Pell Grant indicator, and then you have a Pell Grant indicator for Pell Grants that are what we call like the calculated Pell. We'll get to that in a second. So for the max Pell Grant indicator on the ISAR field is ISAR field 22. Students will get a maximum Pell Grant indicator 1 if the independent student is a non-IRS tax filer, or for a dependent student if their parent is a IRS non-tax filer. For a max Pell Grant indicator 1, they're going to automatically get a negative 1500 SAI. The SAI formula field on the ISAR is going to be blank because there is no overall formula because they're going to get an automatic negative 1500 SAI. There's no immediate values provided on the FAFSA processing section of the ISAR because there was no calculation done. In the SAI computation field, number 22 is populated with that information. So before I get into the maximum Pell Grant Indicator 2, I want to point out a couple of things about the Pell Grant eligibility formula. Unlike the SAI, which is going to use a lot of the data from the tax return, the Pell Grant eligibility is only going to use the AGI, and it's going to compare the AGI to poverty level guidelines that are published by the federal government every year. And what that does is it compares the AGI to the family size. And so this is another instance where the family size comes in. So for a maximum Pell Grant Indicator 2, that's when we start diving into comparing the AGI to the poverty level guidelines published by the federal government. So a maximum Pell Grant Indicator 2 is going to be provided for an independent student who is a single parent or a single parent who has an AGI that is equal to or less than 225% of poverty level guidelines for the year. And the poverty level guidelines that we're going to use is going to be attached to the tax year that we're using for the FAFSA. So it's going to be the prior year's poverty level guidelines. In the same vein, maximum Pell Grant Indicator 3 is going to be for an independent student or a parent who is not a single parent whose AGI is equal to or less than 175% of poverty level guidelines. Maximum Pell Grant eligibility 2 and 3 has an opportunity for an SAI calculation. If you remember, for the maximum Pell Grant eligibility 1, they was given an automatic negative 1,500 SAI. For maximum Pell Grant eligibility 2 and 3, we're going to do a calculated SAI, but what the SAI depends on what the calculated SAI is. If the calculated SAI is less than 0, we're going to let it remain at 0 because it's in the best interest of the student, even though it doesn't have too much of a bearing on federal student aid eligibility. But if the calculated SAI is equal to or greater than 0, it's going to be 0. So if the SAI is greater than 0, we're going to change it to 0. If the SAI calculated is 0, we're going to leave it at 0. And if the calculated SAI is less than 0, we're going to leave it at the calculated SAI because it's less than 0, which is to the benefit of the student. For minimum Pell Grant indicators, you have indicator values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in blank. 1 is for dependent students where the parent is a single parent. The AGI is equal to or less than 325% of the poverty level guidelines. Value 2 is for dependent students where the parent is not a single parent, where the AGI is 275% or less of the poverty level guidelines. Indicator 3 is for independent students who are a single parent whose AGI is equal to or less than 400% of poverty level guidelines. Indicator 4 is for independent students who are not a single parent whose AGI is equal to or less than 350% of poverty level guidelines. And then indicator 5 is for independent students who is not a parent and whose AGI is equal to or less than 275% of poverty level guidelines. And then, believe it or not, we are wrapping up here. So a few things that I want to point out. I wanted to give you within the PowerPoint presentation so that when you download it, you have it. I remember when I was at a school, I used to love having some type of quick guide. I'll show my age about how long ago I was at a school where I would have taken something like this and like taped it to my wall for a reference. And so I'm taking my old school stuff and I'm giving it to you so that you have it also in case you want to do it. It just gives you a quick reference of some of the indicators and the notes that you'll see within the ISAR so you can have a quick reference to it. But I'm also going to highlight, like in the box there on the screen, some of the ones I want to point out specifically. One I wanted to point out specifically is the application source. Application source tells you how the student submitted the FAFSA. So for example, application source 4 is a paper FAFSA. Application source 3 is FAFSA Partner Portal. Application source 2 is the one you're going to see most often, which is an online FAFSA. Application source 3, you're really not going to see anymore because we've lost the ability to submit or for a school to collect a paper FAFSA and to input it themselves into FAFSA Partner Portal, which is something that you guys used to be able to do through FAA access to CPS online. So mostly what you're going to see is application source 4 for paper and application source 2 for the online FAFSA. Two other things I wanted to point out to you is the Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grants Indicator. As a reminder, starting in 24-25 is no longer a separate program or source. It becomes an additional special eligibility for Pell. But on the ISAR, you will still see an indicator of eligibility for Pell under that special rule or consideration. So you have 1, 2, and 3. ISG Indicator 1 is for general eligibility of IASG, but I wanted to point out the Indicator 2 is for grandfather in IASG. Because the FAFSA Simplification Act started with 24-25, changed some of the rules around IASG, there is a grandfathering rule if you have students who are still enrolled who were eligible for IASG under the old rules. Indicator 2 is going to tell you that their ISG is under the old rules, so it is grandfathered in. And then the other thing I wanted to point out to you are the different flags and indicators for unaccompanied homeless youth. Unaccompanied homeless youth comes in yes or no, or yes and blank. The general question of whether or not the student is an unaccompanied homeless youth is yes or no, 1 for yes, 2 for no. But then the different categories about if they have a determination done by one of the authorizing officials and who those authorizing officials are. An indicator of 1 says yes for that authorizing official. If they didn't check off that authorizing official on their FAFSA, it is just blank. So for the incarcerated students, we have 4 different flags for incarcerated students. We have flag 1 if the student did not submit an incarcerated student FAFSA and we determine that the student is incarcerated based on their address. We have been tracking the address of the correctional facilities that our Second Chance Pell Schools and our prison educational programs have partnered with, so we can tell that way. We have flag 2 if we received the incarcerated student FAFSA and we got it into the P.O. box specifically for those FAFSAs. We have indicator 3 if the incarcerated flag was set in FAFSA Partner Portal, which a school can do later on after we process a FAFSA if the student was not marked as incarcerated, and they should be. And then you have 4, which is the incarcerated student flag was removed in FAFSA Partner Portal. We also have an indicator for that. Children of Fallen Heroes is a lot like the Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant. It is no longer a standalone program. It is a special eligibility rule for Pell Grants in general. So we will also indicate that as flags. You have 1, which is eligible for Children of Fallen Heroes, and then you have 2, which is also that grandfather in clause. And then I won't go through it too much. Pay attention to the DHS primary match flag and the secondary match flags. And then look out for the electronic announcement that we had published about some workarounds that you currently have with completing the DHS secondary match flag. For 24-25 right now, institutions can actually go into the DHS SAVE system in order to get the status and kind of push through the secondary matches, since the FAFSA and the ISAR is not doing it automatically right now. And then wrapping it up, we have IRS response codes. Same thing here. I'm not going to go over it with you too much, but I'll just touch on it a little bit. So IRS response codes is the response codes we're getting from the IRS via the FADDX. 200 is pretty self-explanatory. You have a 200 code if it's a successful request, and we got the FTIN. You have a 203 if there was a PII match failed, which means the PII that was on the FSAID, because the PII that's in the FAFSA is coming from the FSAID, does not match a tax record. 206 is a partial delivery of content, which is pretty self-explanatory. 212 is they cannot verify the return data, can't give more information than that, via the IRS. And then 214 is no return on file, no tax return on file. That is also serving as your non-filer verification, which you really don't have to do now because you have 214, which is saying that there's no tax return on file. And then you have blank, which happens when a record was able to do FTI but was rejected by the IRS for different reasons, with an exception of for visually independent students. Most often that's because no consent was given or there was a bad SSA match. So no record was ever sent to the IRS, or the IRS had an outage, is where you might see a blank. So just wrapping up here, thank you guys again for joining me. I just wanted to use this slide and end in here to do another plug for the FSA Training Center. Even when we do trainings, if you miss it, we record it there, so it's there for your convenience. I recommend that you go and you continue to look at those resources. And of course, continue to look at other things that we have available, other sessions at this FSA training conference. And even the one last year has additional information like noted here on this slide. Thank you again for joining me. Thank you again for all of your hard work and dedication to your students. We greatly appreciate it, and thank you for all that you do. Have a great rest of your conference.